Mathias Rust from West Germany was only 19 years old when he landed his light plane in Red Square, Moscow, and flew straight into the history books. It was the 28th of May, 1987. This is the story of a young idealist and his solo flight, which came to play a crucial role in the last year of the Cold War. Hear the story as recounted by 3 Danish Cold War experts and by Mathias Rust himself. It's late morning on Wednesday the 13th of May 1987. The weather is perfect for flying a light aircraft, especially if it's your first long-distance solo flight. Mathias Rust's rented Cessna 172 is on the tarmac and ready for takeoff. The plane's been prepared for a long journey. The first stop is the green pastures of the Faroe Islands, far out in the North Atlantic Ocean. The small plane rolls slowly out onto the runway and Mathias checks the horizon one last time. There's not a plane in sight, so Mathias gives full throttle to the 160 horsepower motor.
I took over the aircraft I used at that time on the 10th of May. I was actually planning to depart from Uetersen, this is a small airfield close to Hamburg, on the 11th. But on that morning the weather was very bad. We had a low ceiling and rain, so I wasn't able to depart on that day already. The same happened on the 12th, and only on the 13th of May, it was a Wednesday, I was able to depart because the weather improved significantly at that time.
It's early morning on the 14th of May. Mathias Rust has just taken off from the tiny Vø airport on the Faroe Islands. He spent the night in a field near the airport and is now on his way again. His target today is Keflavik Airport, just outside the Icelandic capital of Reykjavik. A short 800-kilometer flight directly northwest. Mathias had only had 50 hours of flight training before he started on his journey. His flight instructor at the flight club has said he must be crazy to want to cross the North Atlantic after so few hours of training. That's something most people leave until they have much more experience. But Mathias Rust was not afraid. He's just completed a course in advanced navigation, and right now he's doing what he likes best, sitting behind the joystick. The last of the green Faroe Island cliffs have disappeared behind him, and the Atlantic Ocean stretches out beneath him, blue and peaceful. It will take him around 4 hours to reach Iceland.
Altså på det tidspunkt, hvor det her sker.
At the time this happened, the Cold War was just starting to break down. For many years previously, the East and West had been very rigidly opposed to each other. Moscow had seen one brittle old leader after another. We had Brezhnev, and I remember how pleased I was to go to his funeral in 1982. It was a day to celebrate. He was followed by Andropov, the old KGB chief, another relic of the past, and he didn't last long. He was followed by Chernenko, who was even older and didn't last a year. So there were lots of funerals being held in Red Square at the time, and I went to all of them. Suddenly, Gorbachev turns up, a modern leader who can clearly see that the Soviet Union is falling apart. He wants to introduce glasnost and perestroika, openness and efficiency. This meant that he actually pulled the rug out from under the old communist authoritarian system. He faced very strong internal opposition. especially due to the willingness he demonstrated to begin negotiating with the West about disarmament and monitoring all the nuclear weapons that had become such a heavy political burden on us all. All of Europe was dotted with tactical nuclear weapons and mid-range weapons. The Soviet SS-20 missiles were programmed with targets all over Europe. Our side had begun to set up Pershing nuclear missiles and cruise missiles which could reach Moscow. So it was a tense time. Today we can say that things worked out okay, but they could have gone terribly wrong. Gorbachev was a particularly important player because behind the Kremlin walls he was quietly revolutionizing the past and the old guard.
But then you have to cross over the Atlantic Ocean. Wasn't that a kind of a big thing to do when you flew that long distance for the first time?
Yes, it was kind of thrilling, I have to admit. But actually I did it on purpose because I was sure that the flight to Moscow, if I would dare it, it would put a lot of pressure on me, mentally and physically. So I said, if I'm able to reach Iceland and also able to return back to Europe, I also would be able to do the flight to Moscow.
Keflavik Airport, just outside Reykjavik, Iceland. When Mathias planned his trip, he told his family he would do a short tour of Scandinavia, but he'd known all along that he wanted to do more than that. Over 7 months before Mathias Rust started out, Reykjavik had hosted an historic summit between USA's President Reagan and Gorbachev, the relatively new Soviet leader. The world had held its breath that day. Would the two superpowers finally be able to reach an agreement to take down the countless nuclear weapons targeting Europe and the Soviet Union? Mathias had watched the television news that evening and had seen how the two leaders shook hands amicably as they parted. But he'd also been very deeply disappointed when he heard they'd failed to reach an agreement. That was the evening he decided to do something to bring peace to the world. That's when the idea came to him. He would fly to Moscow and meet Gorbachev.
Reagan
established a relationship of trust with Gorbachev. Gorbachev realized that Reagan wasn't interested in destroying the Soviet Union. He kept the rhetoric firm, but wanted to enter into agreements. Reagan realized that Gorbachev was a man he could make agreements with. So these two sit opposite each other in a courtyard in the outskirts of Reykjavik a few months before Mathias Rust arrives in Moscow, and hold the historic summit, and are very close to reaching an agreement. This is really a case where two people have the opportunity to change the course of history and have mutual trust and respect, making it possible. They failed at the summit, but they were successful 6 months later, after the Mathias Rust incident had made it possible for Gorbachev to remove some of the people at home who were blocking his efforts.
I was going around with a car and I was looking for this house where Gorbachev and Reagan had met, and I was watching it, and I was really very disappointed again that to that time that this historic chance what they had in the autumn before, that they really didn't use it. I was asking myself why it was so difficult really to make the next step.
Mr. President, have you made any real progress, sir?
But to that time I was an idealist. I was 19 years old and I believed only in good things, and I really didn't know about the background of politics and what really is behind of those decisions. I was just thinking that there are two men almost the same age, and I'm sure I was convinced that those men also only want to have an easy life and improving life conditions of other people to make things even more comfortable than they were to that time. And I wondered why they're not just going ahead with reaching out their hands and try to understand each other and to open the next chapter of peace.
Mikhail Gorbachev is in Reykjavik with solid support from Moscow. If there is or has been a political debate about security within the Soviet leadership, it will not become public in a society which does everything it can to maintain a united external face. The Soviet mass media and commentators are describing the Iceland summit with words such as a historic chance, a turning point in the relationship between the superpowers, a unique opportunity to stop the arms race. But more cautious voices have also sounded among the optimistic Soviet chorus. In a recent authoritative article, the chief editor of Pravda wrote that even though there is hope, concern about the outcome of the meeting is just as great. In Gorbachev's speeches, he said there's no way apart from dialogue, but he's also declared unequivocally that the Soviet Union is willing to pay a high economic price to maintain military parity with the USA. But Reagan's SDI project continues to be the main obstacle for the Russians, his plans to create a space-based defense system. Gorbachev has expressly stated that militarizing space is a step towards war. Leif Davidson in Moscow. It's the 28th of May. Mathias Rust has now been travelling for 15 days. From Iceland, he flew to Bergen in Norway and then to Helsinki. It's now 10 minutes since he took off from Malmö airport outside the Finnish capital. He has told the airport tower that he's heading for Stockholm, 560 kilometers to the southwest. But now, 10 minutes after takeoff, he resolutely takes the joystick and banks the plane 180 degrees away from his original route. A few minutes later, the white nose of the plane is flying in the opposite direction towards the east. The Finnish Air Force has monitored the plane the whole time on radar, but east of Helsinki, air traffic control suddenly loses contact with the light aircraft. The Finnish authorities assume the plane has crashed and immediately start a search.
I filled in the flight plan to that time with destination Stockholm, because always when you go abroad you have to fill in a flight plan, and I had to do this because I could not really fill in. I'm going to Moscow because they would have prevented me from departing. On the other side, I wasn't really sure to that time when I filled in the flight plan if I would really dare at the end to make the trip to Moscow. I have to admit it was not really a conscious decision. It was just happening by itself. I only remember that all of a sudden I turned the wheel to the left and I was changing the heading right to heading to Moscow, but it was not really something I remember as an active handling.
But Mathias Rust has not crashed. And if he maintains his current course, it will take him directly into eastern Estonia and hence into Soviet airspace. Mathias Rust knows that what he's doing is dangerous. The plane has to cover more than 900 kilometers through one of the most highly protected airspaces in the world. The risk of being shot down by the Soviet Air Force is very high, and he's given himself a 50-50 chance of surviving all the way to Moscow. It's 1987. The Cold War is no longer at its peak, but it's far from over. So when the tiny green dot suddenly appears on the radar screen, it gets the full attention of the radio operator at a Soviet radar station on the other side of the water. His orders are clear. No plane from the west is to be permitted to fly unimpeded into Soviet airspace. It must be stopped, with force if necessary. In other words, be shot down. There's no doubt in the mind of the radar operator that the tiny green dot on the radar is a clear threat. And the dot continues to move towards the coast and the border.
There was nothing for the next 60 minutes. Only after that, I was approached by a Soviet aircraft, military aircraft. It was just coming across to me, and it was approaching me straight from in front, and then overshooted me. So I could see the pilots sitting in it. I saw the helmets they were wearing, the oxygen masks, and then orange overalls, and I saw this red star on the side of the wing. And I was very scared and very shocked. It was like my heart fell down in my pants, and I was asking myself very, very intensively, what is going to happen next? What they're going to do? They're going to stop me now, or they'll just shoot at me? And there was so many questions spinning in my head at that time that it was really awful, and it was such a relief when I noticed that after 2-3 minutes after they had passed me, that they were just disappeared, and I couldn't really believe it in the first few minutes. I said, was that all? They just came close to me, and then they're just gone like this? Fortunately, they never returned. So there was only a single contact I had with the Soviet air defense.
So he continues to fly across the Soviet Union, passes another region where he should have been detected. But at that time he passes, there's a major emergency operation underway due to a plane crash the day before. There are lots of helicopters and light fixed-wing aircraft in the air. He doesn't mix with them, but the people monitoring him start to confuse his plane with the helicopters, and the people who take over the job of tracking him can't work out who is who. After a flight of more than 900 kilometers, Mathias Rust has finally reached his destination. He prepares to land, but there are too many people in the square and they won't move out of the way to make room. He ascends again, almost hitting a large crane on the way up. But then he sees a wide road bridge that leads into the square. It's perfect. Mathias lands the plane on the bridge without difficulty and taxis straight into Red Square. Outside, the tourists have already begun to crowd around the plane when he opens the door.
That aeroplane's doing suddenly flying over Red Square, but that's what it's doing. There's some people coming out of the Kremlin again. Extraordinary business.
Wie lange ist geflogen? Hier. 5 Stunden. 5 Stunden.
Gorbachev turned the whole story around. After a short time, he used the Rust affair as a basis for harsh criticism of the top military leadership in the Soviet Union, because they'd been sloppy and lacked vigilance and hadn't defended their homeland. So you could say Mathias Rust was like a gift from above. He exploited the situation to say, this is a great scandal, our systems are not working. And he fired a huge number of people in the military and the Ministry of Defense. Funnily enough, all the people who'd opposed some of the agreements with the Americans. So you could say that Rust gave him an excuse to purge the people who'd shown the greatest resistance to glasnost and perestroika. As a result, very soon afterwards, the agreement that we'd been longing for years was reached, the INF Treaty, in which both sides agreed to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear weapons. That's where Mathias Rust and his quirky little stunt ended up playing a key role, because it helped give Gorbachev the power to act that he needed at a critical time.
Few trials before the Soviet Supreme Court have attracted more attention. The family of Mathias Rust had to struggle through the assembled world press as they arrived for the opening day of the case.
Mathias Rust has been charged with 3 offences under Soviet law: crossing the border illegally, breaching international air traffic regulations, and for grossly disorderly conduct, or hooliganism as they call it here. He faces a possible combined sentence of up to 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. We waited for the verdict for a long time, and his mother was there the day it was handed down. We stood and waited for a long time, and then we heard the verdict, and he simply said, "I am reconciled," in German, and his mother said the same thing. Could it happen today? I'm not even sure he'd get away with it today. I think he'd get shut down. Not because North Korea is communist and because Iraq is a theatre of war, but because of September the 11th. See, today, people would shoot first and ask questions later. I think that would also be the case in Moscow. If a light aircraft like this came flying towards Moscow, their first thought wouldn't be, this is Rust 2, just another stunt. In Moscow, they'd immediately think, this is Chechen terrorists, and they'd shoot them down. Get a plane in the air and shoot them down, if they were discovered. He flew around the Kremlin a couple of times, then landed in Red Square. People might have feared he would crash, but no one would have immediately thought, here's a dangerous terrorist coming to kill himself and others. But I don't think he'd have survived today. Whether he flew towards the Danish Parliament, Baghdad, Washington or Moscow, he'd be shot down. People would think, here comes a terrorist loaded up with TNT because he's willing to blow himself up. In 1987, no one thought suicide bombers existed within Europe.
When I reached there, I first saw all the highways going inside the city, and then I noticed the first huge buildings, the Stalin buildings with this red star on top. I think there are about 7. And this is how I noticed that I'm Moscow. At least I believed it's Moscow. And I compared it with my map and the distance. I checked the time, and I saw it's supposed to be Moscow. And then I discovered some significant points like buildings and yards, what I had marked on my map I had bought before, to just make sure that to find really at the end the Red Square. And there was really a problem because in compared with the huge city with I think about 12 million citizens, there was a Red Square really small. So I was just going around and I was approaching the foreign ministry and was thinking maybe that's it. Because there was a yard next to it. I said, no, that's not it. There's a Kremlin wall. I need a Kremlin wall. I need this Basilius Cathedral. There was no church at all. So I was just heading around for about maybe half an hour until I noticed this there was a hotel on my map. It was square, like a cube. Then I noticed this cube building. And next to it, I discovered this church, the St. Basilius Cathedral, and I saw the Red Square and the Kremlin and the wall around. And I was very happy, very released. At least now I discovered my final destination. So my knees were very soft and shaken. I was really tired, and after about 5 hours flight under these difficult conditions. But on the other side, I felt myself so light, so easy, because it was just an unbelievable dream became true. But really, there's no really clear word for describe the situation or the feeling I had at that time when I left the aircraft. I think I'm in between. One day I'm telling myself I shouldn't have done it, because otherwise, when I would have done it, I would have a much easier life. I could have done straight like everybody else did. But on the other side, I always saying that without that experience, without this way of life, without fulfilling my destiny, I would not have come out like I am today. I think with my experience, I would advise everybody to think twice before doing something comparable to what I did in the past. But on the other side, I was saying, if someone is convinced of what he is thinking about, you need to do it. Otherwise, you would regret the entire rest of your life that you never did it. I think this is even worse than to bear the consequences of what you ever do.